All right, welcome to History of the Bible, Part 2. I hope you've been enjoying some of the Bible history stuff. That first work was a little bit more lengthier, and I just wanted to touch on some facts and stuff about, it was really more of a New Testament kind of a view because there's a little bit more modern history, and a lot of it involved adding or removing from the New Testament, although there were certain church leaders I highlighted that they did also have some issues with the Old Testament in their opinions and in their findings, and so I wanted to share their opinions and kind of show that it hasn't always been just a streamlined work where everybody agreed, hey, this thing is guided by the Spirit, or they did have to kind of like add or remove or have councils and dispute and change things. So I just wanted to give a little bit of some shorter additional material before I kind of head backwards into the Old Testament a little bit. I may add a little bit work as I go along because there's a lot of cool stuff to share about this stuff. At least I think it's cool. Not everybody may think it's cool, and that's fine. I hope it appeals to those who like education and like some knowledge in a little bit more fun, concise way that's like not as boring, hopefully. Of course, that's up for opinion and everybody's entitled to one. So anyhow, I just wanted to give some of that. So cool. All right, pretty much all Christians use the exact same New Testament, and it has 27 books, right? There's 4 Gospels, the books of Acts, the 21 epistles, which means letters, and the book of Revelation. Okay, so here is the New Testament, is where one can get away with more of the term, the Bible. Remember I hit on that on the original one because the Bible means different things to different people. But because now the New Testament is a little bit more streamlined with its content, usually when you say the Bible and you mean New Testament, that can be a little bit more of a sure phrase or a sure statement, So I want to cover the Gospels first and give some introductory information about it and then move on to the book of Acts as far as a scholarly point of view. So, okay. The New Testament doesn't tell the story of Jesus just once. It basically tells it 4 times. All right, so basically that's what the Gospels are. They're 4 slightly different versions of the same story about a guy named Jesus who, among other things, was a teacher and a healer and, according to Christians, God in the flesh. So the 4 Gospels, we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they were placed in that order because originally that's kind of the order in which they thought they have been written. But we know a little bit more now. Now we are fairly more certain that this was likely not the order in which they were written. One thing that is very obvious to spot is that one of these letters is really different from the others, and that is the Gospel of John. Okay? Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as the Synoptic Gospels. Syn as in like synonym or synergy, and optic as well, to see. So synoptic means seen together, and although they have a little bit of differences here and there, they pretty much share a lot in common with each other. It's quite easy to spot for scholars that there is copy over from a source onto the others. But what has puzzled scholars ever since the Gospels were written in academic circles is, well, who copied who? And so, now granted, these words mean something different to us in our day and age, and I want to make this distinction very, very, very clear. And I apologize, there's certain points I'm hammering over and over again, but in my opinion, it's very important. If a teacher spots the same story only slightly changed by 4 students, or really in this case 3, the idea would be cheating. And if one takes another's idea, that would be copyright infringement, which is more in our capitalistic mindset currently. In our day and age, it doesn't mean the same for the ancients. That's not necessarily how they wrote. So when I'm using that context, that's what I mean. This is a modern framework of thinking, and it's not how the ancients thought. But it is still a question among scholars and is known as the Synoptic Problem. And there are really no shortage of theories about this stuff, about how to actually solve it, but there are way too many of them. So I'm actually going to really just look at 3 of them. Okay, so I'm going to take a step back first, and I'm going to talk about the authors themselves. Okay, so contrary to popular belief, there are actually no names attributed or attached to any of the 4 Gospels. You know how like in the book of Revelation it says, I, John, right, was on Patmos. Okay, so we know that's a John. We don't know which John, but we know it's a John. Paul starts his letters off, and he's an historical character, and he says, I, Paul, right? So we know who he is. So we don't necessarily know what John wrote Revelation, but we do at least know Paul. But the Gospels themselves, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, none of them have a first-person inference. It was like, hey, I, Matthew, as I write this letter, am walking with Jesus, such and such, okay? So the labeling of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is simply based on tradition and tradition alone. Okay, these are believed to have been based on the names Matthew and John are names belonging to a list of Jesus' 12 disciples, while Mark is thought to have been a helpmate to Peter, and Luke is thought to have been a help to Paul, who was pretty much the most important in the development of early Christianity. Okay, so all four Gospels have strong associations with very important early Christian figures. But did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually write the Gospels that have their name attached to them? If you ask a conservative Christian scholar, the answer is going to be yes. However, most critical scholars, the answer is probably not. Personally, I think it's more highly likely. Just like much of the Old Testament, it was more likely written by a school of thought or a community surrounding the person whose name is put on it. Remember, Paul even talks about camps of Paul or Apollos or Barnabas. You know, there's different camps of people who were influenced. So, for example, the book of Ezekiel was likely not written by Ezekiel, but it was probably written by a school connected to Ezekiel's school of thought. Okay, so even if Matthew didn't write Matthew, it could have belonged to a community connected to Matthew. Okay, so that being said, I'll give three possible solutions to the synoptic problem. I'll start with the most widely accepted solution. It's usually referred to as the two-source hypothesis. Okay, this hypothesis believes that Mark was written first, and both Matthew and Luke used it as a source. Because it introduces an idea of a second source which is available to Matthew and Luke, but not to Mark, this second source is called Q, but unfortunately no longer exists. The idea was that Q was a collection of short sayings attributed to Jesus. Now, some of the reasons why most scholars believe that Mark was written first is the fact that it is the shortest of the three synoptics, with very little material not found in the other two. It uses a grammar that is much less refined and also has a theology that is a little bit more primitive. All right, makes sense? Okay, so the idea was both Matthew and Luke taking what they found in Mark and then improved on it, adding content to it, and really cleaning up the language a bit. All right, so that's the most popular hypothesis. The second most popular answer to this puzzle is known as the Greisbach hypothesis, named after a German scholar who wrote about it almost 250 years ago. Okay, this one argues that Matthew was written first and that Luke was written second using Matthew as a source. Mark's gospel would then be written last of the three. The idea is that Matthew wrote his gospel at a time when the Christian church was still mostly made up of Jews, and that Luke wrote his gospel after Paul starting to spread Christianity to the Gentiles, or non-Jews, and that Mark wrote his gospel as a way to summarize the first two and kind of put Peter's stamp of approval upon both of them. All right. Now, this particular hypothesis does point out for sure is that Matthew is the most Jewishy of all the three, and Luke is the most Gentile focused. Okay, now tradition holds that Luke is the only author in the entire Bible, both Old and New Testament, who actually wasn't Jewish. Tradition holds that he was Greek and a medical doctor, part of it's really being at its focus upon the healing aspect of things. But according to critical scholarship, Luke may simply have just been a Hellenized Jew. Hellenized meaning Greek, that's what they called him. The main problem with the Greisbach hypothesis concerns Mark. If Mark wrote last and had access to both Matthew and Luke to refer to, then why did he leave out key elements like the birth story or post-resurrection appearances? There's a lot of stuff kind of left out. The oldest manuscripts of Mark end with chapter 16, verse 8, where there are three women discover an empty tomb, and they simply run away afraid. pretty much most scholars agree that verses 9 to 19 were added much later. Okay, so the last solution we're going to look at is a little bit more out there in terms of its acceptance. So not so widespread, a little bit more fringe at the moment. And it's called the Q plus Papias hypothesis, brought up by a professor named Dennis MacDonald. Now, MacDonald is also known for putting forward the idea that the Gospel of Mark was modeled on the works of Homer. Now, there's a lot of comparisons that can be made there, and I'll get into that another time. Now, the Q plus Papias, like the two source hypothesis, hold that Q and Mark were written first. Where it differs from the two source is that Q was written before Mark, and that Mark had access to it. This is why we get the term Q plus. MacDonald adds more material to the hypothetical Q document, material usually assigned to Mark. Next comes Matthew, who had access to both Q plus and Mark, and then he adds a document called Papias. Now, Papias was an early bishop who lived from around 60 to 130 CE. We know that from later authors, he wrote a text called the Expositions of the Sayings of the Lord. This source is now lost, but we do have quotes from it found in the work of later authors. It is from these quotations we know that Papias had access to the earlier three sources. So MacDonald goes on to suggest that these were Q plus Mark and Matthew, and that the last synoptic author to write was Luke. And in this theory, Luke probably had access to all four previous works. All right, so just to give you a few theories there on the synoptics for your education. So now let's move on to John and then to Acts, or what's better probably called Luke Acts. Okay, so now as we know, the Gospel of John, of course, is the fourth gospel, but as it was pointed out earlier, it doesn't really have a whole lot in common with the first three. It's kind of like John is telling a completely different story, okay? He adds a lot of events that aren't mentioned in the other three, and he leaves out a lot of events that are mentioned in the other three. In the Synoptic Gospels, you have Jesus giving a lot of short sayings, whereas like in John, you have him giving more longer, complex speeches, okay? One thing that most scholars agree on is that John's gospel is far more theological, whereas the other three are more like straightforward narratives. Theological meaning it's more conceptual than it is, a timeline historical, orientation. Now, it can't be stressed enough that our modern viewpoints tend to lump everything into either fiction or not fiction, and that is absolutely not how the ancient people wrote. They absolutely mix the two all the time. Because of this, typically a lot of people don't know this, and they have an all or nothing approach that you either believe the Bible and you believe all of it, or you believe none of it. And that is just really short-sighted to the ancient perspectives and writing motifs that they had in their culture. Often these two were both used, especially when talking about complex ideas, like God. For them, God wasn't something or someone to be figured out, but to be explained as best as possible using whatever themes, thoughts, concepts, and characters that they can to convey the perspective they're trying to communicate, using things everyone knows about. They weren't trying to say, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and so forth. Instead, they took people they believe existed in the past and made them into literary characters, reboots. They embellished their stories that they had heard about them, and sometimes even placed words into their mouths. Words that express the ideas that they wanted to communicate in the present using those characters. The best way to describe this currently is the use of memes. How often does one see a picture of a person in history or an actor with a comment that the person never said, but the picture combined with the phrase is useful in some ways to convey something of a deep thought or silly humor? I love memes. In the Jewish Bible, even God is a literary character, and that's why he seems to be very different depending on what particular book you're reading. Remember, the Bible is not a book, it's a collection of books. It means library. So now, does this mean that God doesn't really exist? Well, not necessarily. Personally, I believe in God, and maybe you do or maybe you don't, or maybe you do but not in some traditional sort. Either way, I think it's important to understand that the God of the Bible isn't necessarily the God of reality, but rather the God of the Bible is simply many authors' different portrayal of God. If you agree that it's accurate or not at all or somewhere in between, that's completely up to individuals. Because of this knowledge of ancient writing style, I think the same thing can go for the character of Jesus, especially in the case of John's Gospel. Like Mark has Jesus hanging on the cross in absolute pain and agony, shouting when he dies, whereas John has him making more deep statements calmly and then dying in a very serene way. Now, I do very much understand it is a very sensitive topic given that most Christians believe that Jesus said every single word that the Gospels say he said. But it's also possible that the Gospel writers, still ancient writers, took some artistic liberties and crafted their stories in such a way that they could make a point and convey about who they thought Jesus was, rather than simply giving a history record of he did this and he did that. Again, this can likely touch on the all or nothing defensiveness many have about the writings. Now, typically when defensiveness kicks in, there's always a polarization that takes place where the bringer of such information or even new information is immediately given a predetermined label for all those who say something different. And that is called heretic, and depending on your religion, a heretic, an unbeliever, an infidel, or even something comparative like a wolf among sheep's clothing, or even something ethereal, non-tangible like a false angel of light. Look, I want to express. I'm not trying to tell you what to think. I will do more recordings that will indeed express my current opinion. These particular videos are more research and academia, and I try not to give so much of my opinion unless I explicitly express that to the best of my ability. Okay? Now, if after seeing information like what it is that I share, and you completely still hold on to the more historical and literal viewpoints, I'm absolutely fine with that. I'm not trying to take away from anybody's faith. What I am trying to do is inform people who want education about various subjects, who have beliefs running that they don't necessarily know that they have, that may not be based upon factual data. So they may not know even where they got them. You can learn things a long time ago from when we're young and be taught things that may not necessarily be true, okay? So I also want to remove or help address the fear of being educated in themselves, or the fear brought on by others who make them afraid to learn anything outside of their viewpoint, and they call it God. That is to make one's beliefs about God himself, and personally, I have no interest in challenging God himself, if you get what I'm saying. One argument would be that God would sovereignly guide his word throughout time to make it past the hiccups and the foibles of mankind, which is again belief. There's no proof of it, but it's just belief. His word meaning the Bible. But as I point out, the Bible is different in different places all over the world and has gone through many, many changes. If it's about what you believe to be the core beliefs or tenets of your faith, and the most important things are important and other things are just not important to you, then you don't believe that they should be discussed. That is fine if that is your viewpoint for yourself. That is something that must be taken by your own faith and by your own perspective. It is just simply something I cannot personally allow another to keep me from learning, thinking, and sharing about subjects and concepts, because I am absolutely about freedom. Okay? I really love concepts such as being bold as lions. Love that stuff. Other things like the solid rock of Christ, unmovable to storms. Awesome stuff. Because I actually hold faith in such concepts like that, I believe fear of knowledge should have no place in a culture that expresses those kind of beliefs. And hopefully you can also spot that some of the New Testament writers didn't fully agree with each other, and at times were not simply warning about other people outside of their camp, but warning about each other, not just others. And so the same thing in humanity is found today when it comes to various belief systems. It's not even limited to religion. I mean, you got Galileo, who said the earth was round. Then the Inquisition forced Galileo to say that he was wrong, all right? That the earth didn't revolve around the sun. Galileo made that proclamation in his book, The Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. Good read. But before that, he had favor and even drew a pension from the Pope. And Galileo was found guilty of heresy and sentenced to house arrest before he died in 1642. And before him, you have one that's rarely mentioned that was actually murdered by religious authorities, and that's Giordano Bruno. Okay? He proposed that the stars were actually distant suns that had planets around them of their own and could possibly foster their own life. And he had a device that impaled his tongue, imprisoned it because of his wicked words. He was hung upside down naked before finally being burned at the stake. Nice. Okay, so you really got to love those religious authorities that suppress information. No fan of it at all. Now it seems a little archaic to our modern day and age, but what runs in mankind is often in cycles, and any day and age should be relevant to standing up to such religious oppression, especially when they're referring to their beliefs as God himself. Now, one won't often come out and say that their belief systems are God, but if you actually read the traffic, they're actually making their belief systems God themselves, okay? Anyhow, so one more thing about the Gospel of John is that according to some scholars, John has at least 2 layers, okay? So instead of using the Q source, which was simply a list of Jesus' short sayings, it looks like John instead may have possibly used a now lost source that is known as the Signs Gospel, okay, which is a text that listed the various miracles that Jesus was said to have performed. It's possible that John, or more likely a follower of his, used the Signs Gospel as a starting point and then added material around it. All right, so now we'll get into the book of Acts, or the Acts of the Apostles. So the Gospels were told the story of Jesus up until his death and resurrection, and then Acts tells us the story of what the disciples did after he was gone. It tells the story of how the Christian church came to exist, and we happen to know who wrote it, sort of. The person who wrote the book of Acts is the same person who wrote the Gospel of Luke. So traditionally, that would be Luke the physician. Another way of saying it is that Luke Acts is actually a 2-part work that has been unfortunately split up, whereas a better way to arrange the first 5 books would be Mark, then Matthew, then Luke Acts, then John. Now, the mainstream position of the life of Jesus sets his lifespan from about 4 BCE to about 30 BCE. That would mean that in the year 100 CE, there would be people that were still alive who knew Jesus. Now, other than Jesus, the most important person when it comes to the development of early Christianity was none other than Paul. Now, Paul was not one of Jesus' earthly disciples when he was still alive. He became a follower a few years after Jesus died, somewhere between 34 and 37 CE. Although Paul himself was a Jew, he was the person primarily responsible for taking Christianity from being a minor sect of Judaism and making it into a brand new religion, one that consisted mostly of non-Jewish people. Now, Paul is believed to have lived up into the reign of Emperor Nero and was killed somewhere between 64 to 68 CE, which leads up to the most important date for the understanding of the development of both Judaism and Christianity. And that is the year 70 CE, when the temple was destroyed, along with Jerusalem. Before all that, Judaism was a very diverse religion with many different branches, one of them being early Christianity. But the destruction of the temple forced Judaism to evolve. One can even think of 70 CE as the date for which both Christianity and rabbinical Judaism were truly born in a more pronounced way, as both religions developed a way to cope with the loss of the temple. For the rabbis, they shifted the focus into studying Torah and meeting in synagogues for prayer, whereas the Christians shifted the focus onto the person of Jesus and the seeing his death as the replacement for the temple sacrifices. Now, all 3 of the Synoptic Gospels reference the destruction of the temple. Now, unless one interprets these as actually being real prophecies, which many Christians do, this means that the earliest date for any of the Synoptic Gospels to arrive on the scene is 70 CE, considering they all reference the destruction of the temple, which didn't happen until 70 CE. And most scholars place Mark somewhere just shortly after 70 CE, and Matthew and Luke Acts somewhere around 10 to 20 years respectively. Some say 10 each one. Now, Q, if it did exist, would be placed before 70 CE, perhaps as early as 40 CE. John, on the other hand, is placed last, somewhere written about 95 to 100 CE by most accounts. So even though the Gospels may not have been written by the people who they are now named after, they were all likely written during a period when the people who had known Jesus was still alive, which means the Gospels are still fairly good sources about gathering some basic information about the life of Jesus. Now, although some stuff about the Apocrypha is going to be shared, I want to talk about a gospel that didn't make the final cut, and that is the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is one of the other non-canonical gospels that still exist. And yes, we have dozens of other gospels beyond the 4 that just made it into the New Testament. Most of these are believed to have been written much later, but the Gospel of Thomas is the exception. Some scholars say it may have been written around the same time as the main 4. The other interesting thing about this text is that it was actually lost in time. It was a lost script until the manuscript was found in 1945. You can imagine scholars got really excited thinking that this might have possibly been the Q source that had been supposedly gone missing, mainly because Thomas is really primarily a collection of short sayings attributed to Jesus. But once compared to the Synoptics, it became quite clear that this was not Q. It's similar, but it's obvious from the text that Matthew and Mark and Luke did not use the Gospel of Thomas when writing their own Gospels. But anyhow, who wrote it and how does it relate? Well, like I said, it's already best to think about the Gospels as being belonging to creation of certain camps and communities rather than the work of single authors. So like some scholars suggest the existence of a Thomasine community and a Johannine community within early Christianity. Remember Paul, Apollos, Barnabas, everybody had their own followings. So the followers of Thomas saw the resurrection as more being an act of spiritual enlightenment, but the followers of John saw it as a more factual, literal, physical, bodily resurrection. This would explain why John's gospel actually portrays the Thomas character as being the infamous doubting Thomas. Throwing a little bit of shade there, you know what I mean? It just goes to show there was much disagreement among the early Christians as to exactly how to understand Jesus. Okay? And even the most conservative Christian scholar would agree it took hundreds of years for the so-called heresies to actually be stamped out and a more standardized version of Christianity to come forward that we see today. Early Christianity was not a single Christianity, but rather many Christianities. Even today, there is said to be over 41,000 plus denominations of Christianity all across the world. Anyhow, so there. Hope that helps you to educate with some little factoids on concepts and aspects of the New Testament.